Blood and Honor. A Los Angeles Romeo and Juliet. Part 1. Kings of the Streets. Miguel, El Lobo, Reyes stood at the corner of Whittier Boulevard and Eastern Avenue, the evening sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. At 23, he already commanded respect throughout East Los Angeles as the leader of Los Diablos. His fingers traced the outline of the pistol tucked into his waistband, a constant companion in a neighborhood where power was measured in blood and territory. Their moving product on Cesar Chavez, whispered Javier, his lieutenant since childhood. La Familia thinks we won't notice. Miguel's jaw tightened. Ernesto Vasquez, El Tigre to those who feared him, had been testing boundaries for months. The leader of La Familia had expanded his operations steadily westward, encroaching on Los Diablos territory with calculated precision. Tonight we show them what happens when you disrespect Los Diablos, Miguel said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to violence. Across town, Ernesto Vasquez counted stacks of bills in the back room of his mother's restaurant, La Cocina de Gloria. At 25, he had transformed La Familia from a neighborhood crew into a sophisticated operation that controlled much of East La's drug trade. Miguel is sending men to Cesar Chavez tonight, said Carlos, his cousin and right hand. Ernesto smiled, revealing the gold tooth that had become his trademark. Let them come. That night, gunfire echoed through the streets near Hollenbeck Park. 3 La Familia soldiers died, but Los Diablos lost 5. It was the beginning of a war that would define a generation in East Los Angeles, a conflict built on pride, territory, and the desperate economics of surviving in a place the rest of the city had forgotten. Part 2. The Women Behind the Throne. While Miguel and Ernesto built their empires on the streets, 2 women carried different burdens. Consuelo Reyes lit candles at Dolores Mission Church every morning, praying for her son's soul even as she washed the blood from his clothes. A widow at 35, she had raised Miguel alone, watching helplessly as the streets claimed him. Dios mío, protect my son, she whispered to the statue of La Virgen de Guadalupe. Guide him back to the light. Across the parish, Gloria Vasquez clutched her rosary beads, her knees aching against the hard wooden kneeler. She had come to pray for Ernesto, as she did every day. The 2 women recognized each other but never spoke. Their silent acknowledgement contained volumes, each understanding the other's pain without needing words. Both carried the weight of loving men who dealt in death, both sought redemption through faith when earthly justice seemed impossible. Both would eventually become grandmothers to children they desperately hoped would escape the cycle. Part 3. Love and Blood. By 1992, the feud between Los Diablos and La Familia had claimed over 30 lives. Miguel had married Lucia, a teacher who believed she could save him. Ernesto had married Isabella, the daughter of a successful businessman who saw in La Familia an opportunity for expansion. The LA riots came that spring, and amid the chaos, an uneasy truce formed between the gangs as both protected their neighborhoods from outside threats. For a brief moment, Miguel and Ernesto found themselves fighting the same battle, defending their community when the rest of the city seemed content to let it burn. The peace didn't last. By summer, the war had resumed with new intensity. A shootout at MacArthur Park left Miguel with a permanent limp and took the life of Ernesto's younger brother. This ends when he's dead, Ernesto vowed at the funeral, his mother Gloria clutching his arm in silent desperation. Miguel welcomed his daughter, Elena, into the world that December. Standing in the hospital room, holding the tiny bundle against his chest, he felt something shift inside him. She deserves better than this life, he told Lucia. 6 months later, Isabella gave birth to Ernesto's son, Mateo. Holding his boy beneath the crucifix in his mother's living room, Ernesto made silent promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Part 4. The Fall. 1995 brought the biggest LAPD gang sweep in East Los Angeles history. Both Miguel and Ernesto avoided the initial arrests, but their operations suffered heavy blows. With their ranks thinned, territory became harder to defend. Younger crews began challenging their authority. Miguel was arrested in 1997 after a shootout that left 2 rival gang members dead. The evidence was circumstantial, but his record ensured a 15-year sentence. 3 weeks before his trial, Lucia was killed in what appeared to be a random carjacking, though Miguel always suspected Ernesto's hand. Elena, just 5 years old, went to live with her grandmother Consuela, who doubled down on her religious devotion, determined to raise her granddaughter away from the violence that had defined her son's life. Ernesto managed to stay free until 2001, when federal RICO charges finally brought down what remained of La Familia's leadership. He received 20 years but maintained control from prison through an elaborate network of loyalists. Isabella divorced him during his third year inside, leaving young Mateo to be raised by Gloria, who saw in her grandson a chance for the redemption her son had never found. Part 5. The Long Silence. Prison changed both men. Miguel found religion, attending mass regularly and earning his GED. Ernesto became more calculating, using his time to study business and law books. Neither acknowledged the other, though they occasionally crossed paths in the yard at Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution. On the outside, Elena grew into a serious, determined young woman who excelled in school despite the whispers about her father. Consuela made sure she attended church every Sunday, praying that faith would protect her where it had failed Miguel. Mateo showed early musical talent, losing himself in guitar and piano to escape the shadow of his father's name. Gloria encouraged this passion, seeing in music a path away from the streets. Both grandmothers worked tirelessly to ensure their grandchildren would never follow in their father's footsteps. The years passed. Miguel was released in 2012, returning to a neighborhood he barely recognized. Gentrification had begun transforming parts of East LA, pushing out families who had lived there for generations. Los Diablos still existed but as a shadow of its former self. Ernesto gained early release in 2016 due to prison overcrowding. By then, La Familia had fractured into competing sets, none acknowledging his authority. At 60, with health problems from years of prison food and stress, he found himself a king without a kingdom. Part 6. Sunset Gardens. Age comes for even the most feared. By 2022, Miguel had suffered 2 strokes that left him partially paralyzed and with significant memory loss. Consuela, now in her 70s with arthritis that bent her once straight spine, can no longer care for him at home. Sunset Gardens assisted living facility in Boyle Heights was one of the few places that accepted Miguel's limited Medicare coverage. Elena, now 30 and in her residency at USC Medical Center, visited when her grueling schedule allowed, sitting beside the father who sometimes remembered her and sometimes called her by her mother's name. Ernesto's diabetes had progressed to the point where he required regular dialysis and round-the-clock monitoring. After a fall that broke his hip in 2023, Gloria could no longer manage his care. By strange coincidence, or perhaps divine intervention, as Gloria would later claim, Sunset Gardens had an opening in their west wing. Miguel occupied room 212 in the east wing. Ernesto was assigned room 147 in the west. Neither recognized the other. Miguel's memory loss had erased much of his past, while Ernesto's failing eyesight obscured the present. Part 7. Crossed paths. Elena visited her father every Sunday after church with Consuela, bringing fresh flowers and updates on her medical career. 26-year-old Mateo came on Saturdays, guitar in hand, to play the old corridos his grandmother Gloria said Ernesto had loved in his youth. They met one Tuesday evening in July, when both had unexpectedly stopped by after work. Elena had brought a new medication she thought might help with her father's agitation. Mateo had come to drop off the homemade tamales his grandmother had prepared. They collided in the community room, Elena's paperwork scattering across the floor. "I'm so sorry," Mateo said, kneeling to help gather the fallen papers. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "It's fine," Elena replied, noticing his kind eyes. "I was in a hurry." "You're here visiting someone?" he asked, handing her the last of the forms. "My father. He had a bad day yesterday, and I wanted to check on him." "Same reason I'm here," Mateo said. "My grandmother made my abuelo's favorite food." The nurses say familiar tastes sometimes help with his confusion. They introduced themselves with just first names, unaware of the weight their surnames would carry. Before parting, they exchanged phone numbers, Elena thinking Mateo might want recommendations for managing his grandfather's care, Mateo hoping to see her smile again. Part 8. Blooming love. Their relationship developed slowly over coffee meetings and conversations in the Sunset Gardens courtyard. Elena found in Mateo a gentleness she hadn't experienced in the ambitious medical students and doctors who populated her daily life. Mateo was drawn to Elena's compassion and strength, so different from the women he met in Los Angeles' music scene. 3 months passed before they learned each other's last names. The revelation came during a dinner at a small restaurant in Alhambra, far from their old neighborhood. "Vasquez," Elena repeated, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "From East LA?" Quote. "Yes," Mateo nodded. "My father was Ernesto Vasquez. He ran with La Familia back in the day." The color drained from Elena's face. My father is Miguel Reyes. The silence between them stretched, filled with the weight of a history neither had lived but both had inherited. Should I call you a cab? Mateo finally asked, his voice tight. Elena considered her answer carefully. In her work at the hospital, she had treated too many young men with gunshot wounds, had pronounced too many dead from the same cycle of violence that had consumed their fathers. No, she said finally. Our fathers made their choices. We don't have to carry their war. That night marked a turning point. What had been a casual attraction deepened into something more profound, a defiance against the past, a reclamation of their own futures. Part 9. The Discovery. Neither Elena nor Mateo initially told their grandmothers about the relationship. Both women had sacrificed everything to keep their grandchildren away from their father's world. Both would see this connection as a dangerous return to a past better forgotten. The truth emerged when Gloria found text messages on Mateo's phone. At 73, she still checked his communications occasionally, a habit born from years of vigilance against La Familia's attempt to recruit her grandson. Reyes. She confronted him, her hands shaking. You're seeing Miguel Reyes' daughter. Do you know how many of our family died because of him? Quote. Abuela, Elena isn't her father, Mateo argued. She's a doctor. She saves lives. Gloria crossed herself. Dios mío, what would your father say? Quote. My father gave up the right to have any say in my life when he chose La Familia over us. Across town, Consuelo received the news with similar horror when Elena finally confessed. That family has blood on their hands, she said, clutching her rosary. Vasquez men bring only death. Mateo brings music, Abuela, Elena replied. He's never held a gun in his life. Both grandmothers independently decided to visit their former enemies, not out of reconciliation but to demand an end to this relationship before history could repeat itself. Part 10. Unexpected recognition. The confrontation occurred on a Sunday afternoon. Gloria arrived at Sunset Gardens first, determinedly wheeling herself toward the east wing where she knew Miguel now lived. Consuelo arrived minutes later, her cane tapping angrily as she made her way to Ernesto's room in the west wing. They passed each other in the central garden, two elderly women with parallel missions, and stopped, recognition flickering across faces now lined with age. Gloria Vasquez, Consuelo said, her voice softer than she'd intended. Consuelo Reyes, Gloria replied, the decades falling away. Neither spoke for a long moment. They had seen each other countless times at Dolores Mission Church, had knelt before the same Virgin, had prayed for deliverance from the same violence. Now their grandchildren's lives intersected in ways neither could have imagined. Your grandson is seeing my Elena, Consuelo finally said. Gloria nodded. I came to speak to Miguel about it. Miguel barely remembers his own name most days, Consuelo sighed. Even if he knew, what could he do now? What can any of us do? Quote. The fight seemed to leave Gloria's body. We fought so hard to keep them away from all of this. Perhaps, Consuelo said slowly, this is not a return to the past but something new. Part 11. The Revelation. That afternoon, something extraordinary happened. As the grandmothers sat together in the garden, trying to make sense of this new reality, both Miguel and Ernesto were brought outside for fresh air by their caretakers. Placed at opposite ends of the courtyard, neither man initially noticed the other. Elena and Mateo arrived together, unaware that both grandmothers had discovered their secret. They froze at the sight of their entire families gathered in one place. Miguel, in a rare moment of clarity, looked across the garden and saw Ernesto. Something shifted in his gaze, a shadow of recognition, a ghost of memory. Tigre, he called, using a name he hadn't spoken in decades. Ernesto turned at the sound, his rheumy eyes narrowing. Lobo. He replied uncertainly. The nurses looked confused, but Gloria and Consuelo exchanged shocked glances. These were names from another life, street names that belonged to young men who no longer existed. Miguel gestured weakly for his former enemy to join him. After a moment's hesitation, Ernesto nodded to his nurse to wheel him across. Elena gripped Mateo's hand as they watched their grandfathers meet again after all these years, not as rivals but as two old men reaching the end of their journeys. We were kings once, Miguel said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. We were fools, Ernesto replied, but without bitterness. Part 12. The Reconciliation. What followed was a conversation 30 years overdue. As their families watched in stunned silence, Miguel and Ernesto spoke of the past without the energy for anger or blame. Their memories were fragmented, softened by time and illness, but the recognition was real. "I thought I was building something that would last," Ernesto said, gesturing vaguely at the world beyond Sunset Gardens' walls. "Now I can't even remember the names of the streets we fought over." Miguel nodded. "My Elena, she saves lives now. Puts back together what men like us broke." "Mateo makes music," Ernesto said with unexpected pride. "Beautiful sounds. Nothing like the noise we made." Elena and Mateo approached cautiously, still holding hands. The sight seemed to focus both old men. "Your grandson?" Miguel asked, looking at Mateo. "She," Ernesto confirmed. "And this is your daughter's child?" Quote. "My granddaughter," Miguel corrected. "They look good together, no?" Quote. The simple observation, so ordinary from any other grandfather, so extraordinary from these men, broke something open in the gathering. Consuela began to cry softly. Gloria reached for her hand. "Perhaps," Gloria said, echoing Consuela's earlier words, "this is God showing us another way." Consuela nodded. Not forgetting the past, but not prisoners to it either. Part 13. A new chapter. The months that followed brought changes no one could have predicted. Miguel and Ernesto began taking their meals together in the dining room, sometimes reminiscing, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Their friendship, if it could be called that, was tentative but genuine, built on the shared experience of outliving their own legends. More remarkably, Gloria and Consuela began meeting for coffee after Sunday Mass, their lifetime of parallel suffering finally finding voice in conversation. They spoke of the sons they had raised and lost to violence long before prison took them, of the grandchildren they had protected with fierce determination, of the faith that has sustained them through it all. "I hated your son for so many years," Gloria admitted one afternoon. "I blamed him for everything Ernesto became." "And I blamed Ernesto for the man Miguel turned into," Consuelo replied. "But they made their own choices, didn't they? Just as our grandchildren are making theirs now." Elena and Mateo's relationship deepened. He began playing guitar for the residents at Sunset Gardens on weekend afternoons. She organized a health clinic for the elderly in the community room. Together, they created something healing in the very place their grandfathers had come to end their days. 6 months after that fateful meeting in the garden, Mateo proposed. Elena accepted. Then came the question of how to honor their family's complicated history while moving forward. Part 14. Honor without violence. The wedding planning revealed how much had changed, and how much remained unresolved. Both grandmothers wanted the ceremony at Dolores Mission Church, where they had prayed through the darkest days of the feud. Father Martinez, who had buried too many victims of the violence between Los Diablos and La Familia, agreed to officiate. "This union is a blessing," he told the families. "A sign that reconciliation is always possible." But questions remained. Would Miguel and Ernesto attend together? Would former members of either gang come to pay respects? How would the community that had witnessed their war respond to this symbolic peace? 2 weeks before the wedding, Miguel suffered another stroke. From his hospital bed, he beckoned Ernesto to his side. "We should have ended this long ago," he said, his speech slurred but determined. "Yes," Ernesto agreed. "But we were too proud." "Not our grandchildren," Miguel insisted. "They must not carry our shame." Ernesto nodded, understanding what his old rival was asking. Together, they drafted a message to be shared with what remained of their former organizations. The war was officially over. The marriage of Elena Reyes and Mateo Vasquez had their blessing. Anyone who failed to respect this peace would answer to both families. The declaration, coming from men who had once commanded fear and loyalty throughout East Los Angeles, carried surprising weight. Word spread through the old networks, reaching men now middle-aged with children of their own, men who had moved on but still carried the scars and tattoos of their youth. Part 15. A wedding and a legacy. The church overflowed on the day of the wedding. Former members of Los Diablos sat on one side, former La Familia on the other, mirroring the old territorial divisions but without the animosity. Many came out of respect, others out of curiosity, all witnesses to the closing of a bloody chapter in their community's history. Miguel, still weak from his stroke but determined to fulfill his role, was wheeled down the aisle by his nurse. Ernesto followed, his diabetic complications requiring him to use oxygen but his pride evident in his straight-back posture. Elena entered on the arm of her uncle, Miguel's younger brother, who had escaped the gang life by joining the army. She wore a dress that incorporated elements of her grandmother's wedding gown. Mateo waited at the altar, his guitar nearby. He had composed a piece especially for their first dance. "Dearly beloved," Father Martinez began, "we are gathered here today not only to join Elena and Mateo in holy matrimony, but to witness the healing of old wounds, the bridging of divides that once seemed insurmountable." Consuela and Gloria sat in the front pew, holding hands like sisters. Their decades of faithful prayer had yielded an answer neither could have imagined. When it came time for the mother's blessing, a traditional part of Hispanic Catholic weddings, the two grandmothers rose together. Gloria spoke first. "From pain can come beauty," she said, her voice carrying through the hushed church. "From hatred can come love. This is God's greatest miracle." Consuela nodded, continuing, "We bless this union not despite our history but because of it. Through Elena and Mateo, our families find the peace we have prayed for all these years." As vows were exchanged and rings blessed, those present felt the weight of the moment. This was more than a wedding. It was a community turning a page, choosing a future different from its past. Epilogue. Full circle. 1 year after the wedding, Sunset Gardens held a special celebration. Miguel and Ernesto, both continuing their slow decline but still present enough to appreciate the moment, sat together in the garden where they had first recognized each other. Elena was visibly pregnant with twins. Mateo had recently been offered a position teaching music at a high school in the neighborhood, working with at-risk youth who reminded him of what his father might have been under different circumstances. "Life is funny," Miguel said, watching Elena laugh at something Mateo whispered in her ear. "All those years fighting over concrete and corners, and in the end, our blood mixes anyway." Ernesto nodded. "Our grandchildren will outlive our mistakes." Consuela and Gloria bustled around them, arguing good-naturedly about baby names and nursery colors. Their friendship had deepened into something neither would have thought possible, a bond forged through shared suffering and unexpected joy. As the California sun began to set over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the garden much like it had decades ago when two young men stood on opposite corners of the barrio, Mateo took out his guitar. He began to play a melody that spoke of both sorrow and hope, of endings and beginnings. Elena joined her husband, placing her grandfather's weathered hand on her rounded belly. "Feel that? They're dancing already." Miguel smiled. "What will you name them?" Quote, "Paz and Esperanza," Elena replied. "Peace and hope. If they're girls." Miguel and Ernesto if they're boys. The old rivals exchanged looks, surprise, then silent understanding. Their names would continue, but attached to innocent lives untainted by the choices they had made. In this small courtyard, surrounded by family that had once been enemy, they had found something neither power nor territory could provide. The knowledge that they would not be remembered only for the blood they had shed, but also for the love that had, against all odds, blossomed in their shadow. The legacy of Los Diablos and La Familia would not be written only in scars and prison sentences and gravestones, but also in the new life growing beneath Elena's heart, life that carried both bloodlines, both histories, both possibilities. The future would remember not just how the war had raged, but how it had finally, improbably, ended. Not with more bloodshed, but with a love stronger than decades of hatred. As night fell over Sunset Gardens, the old soldiers of a forgotten war sat peacefully side by side, watching the legacy they never expected unfold before them, proof that even in the harshest urban landscapes, where concrete and desperation has seemed to choke out all possibility of growth, love could still find a way to bloom. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. And don't forget those post notifications for the next Hood Tales installment.